I had commanded operating rooms where split-second decisions determined life or death. I had seen hearts stop and return to beating under my hands. But nothing shattered me as much as the moment I saw my 3-year-old daughter, unconscious, being taken out of an ambulance. In that instant, the confident doctor gave way to a powerless father. Science, which had always seemed absolute, revealed its limits. In that void, something greater began to speak to me, and I was never the same again. My name is Dr. David Stein. I am 50 years old and I live in the United States. For decades, my identity was shaped by the title of cardiovascular surgeon and by the pride of believing that science alone was enough to answer every question about existence. I grew up in a traditional Jewish family, but over time I drifted away from faith, convinced that religion was nothing more than a comfort for those unable to face reality with logic and reason. For many years I carried that stance as if it were armor. I believed that saving lives with scalpels and technical knowledge was proof that I needed nothing beyond what could be measured or proven. But the day I saw my daughter hovering between life and death tore that armor apart and forced me to confront something I had never considered. Perhaps science was not enough to bear the weight of human pain. Before continuing with my story of conversion, write in the comments where you are watching from. I want to know how far this testimony is reaching. For years, I had grown used to being the steady voice in the midst of chaos. When a life hung by a thread, the team looked to me for decisions. In the hospital, my tone of voice set the pace, my hands guided the scalpels, and my orders were followed without hesitation. I believed that authority came solely from science and experience, as if I were the absolute architect of life and death. But when I saw my little girl, only 3 years old, being carried out of the ambulance unconscious, everything collapsed inside me. No scalpel could cut through that fear. No protocol could ease the weight crushing my chest. My hands, which had so often operated on hearts in crucial minutes, could not even hold onto the railing in the hallway. I wanted to rush into the emergency room, shout instructions, take control as I had always done, but I realized, with unbearable pain, that I was not the surgeon there. I was only a desperate father, and facing that small body, intubated and surrounded by wires, every certainty I had built throughout my career felt as fragile as glass. Seconds dragged as if in slow motion. I heard colleagues giving orders, saw hands moving quickly to stabilize my daughter, but the sound echoed far away, as though I was outside my own body. For the first time, I understood what so many families must have felt when I delivered my cold, professional words, the feeling of standing before a bottomless abyss. How many times had I said things like, "We'll do our best," or "The next few hours are critical." Now those same words echoed back at me, and I finally understood what they truly meant. The arrogance I had carried began to crack. I, who had always believed I needed neither faith nor prayer, found myself unable to control even my daughter's breathing. Medicine was indispensable, but it was not enough to calm the despair growing inside me. In that moment, the title of doctor became meaningless. The entire world seemed to shrink into that hospital bed, and yet I had no power to change anything. It was in that abyss of helplessness that unexpected words escaped my lips. They were not technical terms, not orders. They were short, awkward, almost whispered. "God, if you exist, don't let me lose my daughter." I barely recognized my own voice. For the first time, I admitted I had no control. For the first time, I bowed to the possibility of a power greater than every book and machine I knew. That moment was neither a professional victory nor a medical defeat. It was the collapse of a man who had believed himself master of his own fate, discovering in an instant that he was nothing but dust before the mystery of life. Sitting there, my face in my hands and my heart in pieces, a search was born that I never would have begun without the pain. I closed the door to a hospital break room, and for the first time in decades, I couldn't maintain the image of the rational doctor. I was no longer the expert who commanded protocols and coordinated teams. I was just a broken man, a father in agony. I sat on a metal chair, elbows on my knees, face buried in my hands. The silence mocked me, reminding me that all my self-confidence had evaporated the instant I saw my daughter taken to the emergency unit. The words that came were not rehearsed. They did not come from liturgy books, nor were they shaped by tradition. They spilled out like someone falling off a cliff, broken up by sobs I couldn't control. "God, if you exist, save my daughter. I will follow the path that pleases you." It was simple, raw, desperate. I didn't know if I was praying or begging, but I knew it wasn't silence anymore. It was the cry of someone finally admitting he had no control. I felt ashamed of myself in that moment. I, who had so often mocked religious colleagues, calling them naive for believing in something unseen, was now clinging to the very thing I had ridiculed. It was as if a wall had collapsed inside me. For the first time, the skeptic's mask fell, and I stood exposed before a possibility I had never taken seriously. Maybe life was not just the result of probabilities, statistics, and human knowledge. Minutes felt like hours. I couldn't bring myself to return to the emergency room. The weight of the promise I had made still burned within me. Follow the path that pleases you. I had no idea what that meant, but I couldn't erase those words from my heart. It was as if they had been carved there, permanent, unshakable. The only certainty I had was this: if my daughter survived, nothing could remain the same. When I finally took a deep breath and pushed the door open, the first thing I heard was the steady rhythm of the machines. The sound was not the same as when I had left. It was stronger, alive. My heart pounded as I stepped closer and saw that she was starting to respond. Small signs, but enough to fill the medical team with hope. At the center of the room, among nurses and residents, was a Muslim colleague, Dr. Hassan. Until then, our interactions had been superficial, marked by professional distance. But in that moment, I saw in him a calmness I could not find in myself. His movements were precise, his orders confident, but there was something beyond technique. He carried a trust that seemed to come from more than knowledge. When he looked at me and said calmly, "She's going to be fine," I nearly collapsed. Relief came instantly, but it brought not only peace, it also brought restlessness. Because deep down I knew, minutes earlier, alone in a quiet room, I had prayed a prayer I never thought I would say. And now, before my eyes, the impossible seemed to unfold. Coincidence? Science? An answer? I could not explain, but inside me something began to stir, opening a door I had always kept locked with pride. I stumbled out of the emergency room as if I no longer recognized the world around me. Each step carried the weight of the promise I had made. If she lived, I would have to keep it. And that promise, born from despair, was becoming the anchor pulling me toward an entirely new path. When I opened the emergency room door, I came across a scene I will never forget. It was not the cold, purely technical environment I was used to seeing. In that moment, everything seemed filled with meaning. My daughter was surrounded by monitors, nurses, and agile hands trying to stabilize her. At the center of all that movement was Dr. Hassan, my colleague on duty. Until then, he had always been just one more in the team. A competent professional, discreet, a man of few words. I greeted him out of formality, never once caring about his personal life, much less about the faith he carried so simply. There was an invisible barrier between us, built by my own prejudice. I, a skeptical Jew, saw his religion as something distant, perhaps even exotic, but never relevant. Yet there he was, astonishingly calm, carrying out each gesture as if beyond technique there was trust in something greater. I observed the way he organized the team, precise orders, steady eyes, a firm silence between decisions. There was no hesitation in his movements, but neither was there arrogance. It was as if behind those trained hands there was a force that gave him serenity. And it was that serenity that unsettled me, because while my body trembled, he seemed upheld by something unseen. At one point, our eyes met. He noticed my despair, but did not look away. He walked a few steps closer, and without raising his voice said, "She's going to be fine." There was no statistic in that phrase, no calculated language we usually use to comfort families in critical situations. It was more than a medical evaluation. It was a certainty spoken with faith. Hearing it, something inside me collapsed. I didn't know whether to cry with relief or fear what it could mean. As the numbers on the monitors began to improve, a flood of thoughts overwhelmed me. Could the desperate prayer I had whispered minutes earlier have echoed somehow? Was it a coincidence that this colleague, until then invisible to me, was on duty for the decisive moment of my daughter's life? I searched for technical explanations, but the scene before my eyes could not be reduced to protocols. I didn't say anything aloud, but inside me an uncomfortable question was born. What if this man was being used as an instrument of an answer I had never considered real? It was easier to think it was nothing more than medical efficiency. Yet my racing heart insisted there was something beyond. I sat back down, this time without the mask of the specialist trying to keep control. I began to observe Hassan with new eyes. I remembered how many times I had seen him slip away at certain hours to pray. How many times I and other colleagues had whispered sarcastic remarks about it in the hallways. And yet, now I saw meaning in every one of those gestures. What I once dismissed as empty ritual seemed to be the very source of the calm that sustained him in the face of the impossible. That day, there was no sermon, no religious debate, no attempt at persuasion. There was only presence. A man who served with both excellence and faith, while I, the doctor who trusted only in science, found myself fragile and dependent. As I left the room with my daughter stabilized, I felt a seed had been planted. It wasn't faith yet, but it was a crack in a pride that until then had seemed unbreakable. I realized that if there was a God listening to my prayer, he had chosen an unexpected instrument to answer, the very man I had never valued. My daughter began to breathe on her own. The monitor readings stabilized, and the nurses recorded her progress as an expected improvement. The medical reports spoke of positive response, of surprising recovery, of clinical factors aligning in our favor. But I couldn't hear those explanations without remembering the scene from minutes earlier. Me alone in a room, hands over my face, whispering the first sincere prayer of my life. Each time I looked at her, fragile, still with tubes attached and bandages covering her small body, my heart filled with gratitude, but also with unease, because alongside relief came a demand. Not from anyone outside, but from within. I knew exactly what I had promised. My trembling voice had said, "If you exist, save my daughter, and I will follow the path that pleases you." Now that she was surviving, the echo of those words returned as a constant reminder. In the following days, between medical visits and routine exams, my inner world fell into conflict. As a doctor, I should have only thanked the team, the protocols followed, the speed of the intervention. But as a father, I couldn't deny the spiritual weight of that moment. I felt indebted not to statistics, but to God himself. That awareness began to follow me in every detail. When I saw her slowly open her eyes, I remembered the promise. When I heard her whisper something faintly, the memory struck me. When nurses remarked, "She's a fighter," my inner reply was different. "No, she's a gift." I began to fear the nights. In the silence, when everyone was asleep and the ICU remained in shadow, the words I had spoken in haste in that break room returned. "I will follow the path that pleases you." But what did that mean? Where did that path begin? How could a skeptic, a man used to mocking faith and distrusting anything unprovable, now commit to something he didn't understand? I searched for answers in what I knew. I picked up the Torah again, texts I hadn't opened since youth. I found comfort in some passages, but also unanswered questions. It was like looking at a puzzle with missing pieces. There were unfinished promises, hints of something pointing beyond. That sensation left me even more unsettled, as if the vow I had made could not be fulfilled by merely returning to my roots. At the same time, Hassan's face, my colleague who led the emergency, returned often to my thoughts. I remembered the steadiness of his hands, the calm in his eyes, the short phrase he had spoken with such certainty. He had not tried to preach, but his very presence seemed to shout a silent truth. It was impossible not to connect that episode with the promise I had made minutes earlier. If God had answered my prayer, could it be that he was also showing me a direction? As my daughter grew stronger, the question grew louder within me. What does it mean to follow the path that pleases God? It felt like a calling I could no longer ignore. I still didn't know what steps to take, but I knew life could not return to what it was. The self-assured doctor, skeptical and relying only on manuals, had been left behind in that room where I cried for help. It was in that awakening that something changed in me. I no longer saw patients the same way. Every child who arrived at the hospital reminded me of mine. Every distressed family brought back the memory of my own fragility. For the first time, I began to feel that the profession I had carried with such pride could also be a way to fulfill part of the vow, to serve not only with skill, but with true compassion. The dilemma, however, remained. I needed more than feelings. I needed direction. And the more I thought about it, the more I found myself facing the same question that had followed me since that day. How could I fulfill what I had promised to God? This was not a debt I could repay with titles or successful surgeries. It was a commitment of the soul. And it was in this silent struggle between gratitude and obligation that my heart began to open to possibilities I had never before considered. The awakening of that promise did not bring ready-made answers, but it lit the flame of a search. And without realizing it, that search had already begun to transform me. The return home, after my daughter's discharge, did not bring the rest I had imagined. She was playing again, still fragile, but inside me a restlessness grew that would not leave. I remembered the promise made in the hospital and realized I could not ignore it. The first door I tried to open in search of understanding was to return to what had shaped me in childhood, the sacred texts of my tradition. I took the Tanakh from the shelf, its cover worn by time, and began to read. The stories I had known since boyhood resurfaced with a new intensity. Moses leading the people, Elijah confronting kings, Isaiah speaking of justice. I had always admired these accounts as historical records and, at the same time, as symbols of identity for us Jews. But in that season, something sounded different. I was not reading as a curious doctor or as someone revisiting cultural memory. I was reading as a man indebted to the Creator, searching for clues to understand what it meant to truly follow Him. At first, I found comfort. The Psalms so often sung in synagogues now seemed to speak to me personally. Words like, "The Lord is my shepherd," or "He is a refuge in times of trouble," were not just verses, but descriptions of everything I had felt beside my daughter's hospital bed. Yet as I read on, questions surfaced that I could not silence. There were passages where the prophet spoke of someone to come, a messenger who would bring God's words and establish justice. That detail had always gone unnoticed in previous readings, but now it became a constant disturbance. Who was this one foretold? Had he already come? Or was he still to come? The texts seemed to open a window but never revealed the whole view. It was as if the picture remained unfinished. Each night became a plunge into this dilemma. I read for hours, made notes, compared translations. It felt like standing before a map, pointing to a road that did not end in Israel alone, but went further. This realization left me divided. Part of me wanted to cling to the safety of the tradition passed down by my parents, but another part whispered there was more, a continuity I could no longer ignore. I spoke with some rabbis, seeking guidance. They reinforced the importance of the Torah and of community life, but when I brought up the prophecies of a future messenger, the answers were evasive or closed, with explanations that did not satisfy my heart. It was as though there was an invisible wall no one wanted to cross, and inside me grew the conviction that the very key I was searching for lay behind that wall. I remember one night when I paused before Isaiah's words about a suffering servant, someone rejected yet who would bring healing and reconciliation. I closed the book and sat in silence, caught between fear and hope. Could I be facing something greater than the tradition I knew? Could it be that the vow I made to God could only be fulfilled by acknowledging that continuation? The weight of these questions began to change the way I looked at life. When I treated patients, I no longer saw only bodies to be healed, but stories that could end at any moment. Each heartbeat echoed the urgency I felt to find answers. I was no longer satisfied with medical explanations or repeated theological formulas. What my heart longed for was complete truth. It was in this process that the eyes of my spirit opened to something essential. It was not only about religion or cultural identity. It was about hearing the voice of God, the one I had called on in despair, who now seemed to be leading me beyond the boundaries I had known. The Tanakh had been the starting point, the firm root, but within its own pages I saw signs of a promise still unfolding. This search did not give me rest, but it gave me direction. And it was in that movement, in confronting my own origins, that the ground was prepared for the next step, a step I never would have predicted, but which, in some way, was already written between the lines of what I read night after night. The nights became long and silent. I had already revisited my own roots, yet I still felt the answers slipping through my fingers. So I decided to broaden the search. If the promise I made to God required a path, I needed to examine every possible road. I began with Christianity. I picked up a copy of the New Testament, curious to see if I would find there the echo of what my heart was seeking. At first, I was touched by some words attributed to Jesus. They spoke of love, compassion, of looking to the marginalized. There was beauty there. But as I read further, obstacles appeared. The concept of the Trinity seemed to me an unsolvable riddle. How could there be one God and at the same time three distinct persons? My mind, trained in medical logic, rejected such a formula. Moreover, I noticed that Jesus himself, in several passages, referred to himself as a servant, as one sent, not as God himself. That contradiction troubled me. The heart, searching for clarity, did not find peace. Dissatisfied, I turned to Eastern philosophies. I delved into Buddhist and Hindu texts, and even into meditation practices. I found thought-provoking reflections about inner discipline, detachment from material things, and finding balance amid chaos. But one detail kept me from embracing them. None of those traditions spoke of a personal God. They were paths that valued inner search, but always left me alone before the universe. I did not need only introspection. I needed a creator who listened, who had answered the cry I made in the hospital when I saw my daughter between life and death. Philosophies that spoke only of self-overcoming could not fill the gap left by my prayer. Then I tested modern spirituality, self-help books, motivational lectures, concepts mixing science with mysticism, beautiful phrases, inspiring metaphors, promises of prosperity and positive energy. But as soon as I closed the book, the emptiness returned. It was like consuming sugar, immediate satisfaction that faded quickly without real nourishment. These ideas spoke of inner strength, but not of obedience to one true God. They spoke of cosmic vibrations, but not of the hand that upholds the universe. With each attempt, I ran into a wall. My heart longed for answers that were simple yet solid. I wasn't searching for a philosophical system, nor did I want a tangle of symbols to interpret. What I was seeking was the God who heard my trembling voice in the hospital room, the same one who placed my daughter back in my arms. If he answered, it was because he was alive, attentive, unique, and none of the paths I had explored so far spoke of him in that way. There were nights when I closed the books and simply sat in silence, staring at the table covered in notes. I felt as if I were going in circles, examining doors that, though beautifully decorated, never truly opened. My heart remained restless. The answers I found were partial, sometimes even inspiring, but none matched the cry that still echoed within me. God, if you exist, show me the path that pleases you. What struck me most was that the more I read, the more I remembered Dr. Hassan's serene gaze. He hadn't preached to me, hadn't tried to persuade me. He had only said, "It was not by chance." That phrase, repeated in my mind, sounded like an invitation to consider what I had yet to explore. Until that moment, I had studied almost everything except Islam. I, a Jew by birth and a skeptic by training, had ignored the very faith of the man who became an instrument at the most critical moment of my life. That was when I understood. Perhaps all those doors I had visited were necessary for me to recognize what didn't fit. Each had shown me something, but none had given me what I needed most, the certainty of one God who hears, responds, and guides. The promise I made in the hospital still stood, and I knew that sooner or later I would have to confront the faith I had kept at a distance. This realization cleared the way for the next step. I was no longer only in search of ideas, but of truth, and for that, I would have to walk through the door I had until then avoided. I was sitting in the doctor's lounge, buried in reports that no longer held my attention. My eyes skimmed the technical lines, but my mind was elsewhere. In the emptiness none of the philosophies I had explored could fill. It was in this setting of routine that Dr. Hassan entered. He carried no rehearsed speeches, no theatrical gestures. He simply approached with his usual calm, holding a small book with a plain cover. "I want to give you this," he said softly. "Don't feel pressured. Read it in your own time." He extended his hand, and in it was an English translation of the Quran. There was no insistence, only respect. He placed the book on the table and left, as if he had just done something natural, expecting no thanks. That object remained before me for hours. I stared at the closed cover with a mix of curiosity and fear. Part of me wanted to open it immediately. Another part feared that inside lay the answer that would change everything, and I wasn't sure I was ready. I took it home, but left it on the living room table for days, only glancing at it from time to time like someone staring at a riddle he isn't yet brave enough to solve. That week, the silence of the nights grew heavier. I remembered the promise I made in the hospital and, inevitably, the look in my daughter's eyes when she began to breathe again. It was on one of those sleepless nights that I finally decided to open the book. I didn't plan the reading. I simply let it fall open where it would. The first lines my eyes met were from Surah Al-Fatiha, and as I read, I felt an inner jolt. It was as if someone had written down the very words I had whispered in my moment of deepest despair: acknowledgement of one God, a plea for mercy, a request for guidance to the straight path. It wasn't just literature. It was a mirror of the desperate prayer that had slipped from my lips in that empty hospital room. My heart pounded. I, who had so often dismissed faith as the crutch of the weak, now saw something I could not ignore. How could it be coincidence that the very first passage I read echoed, almost word for word, the cry I had uttered without ever having known those lines before? I kept reading. Each verse seemed to speak directly to my accumulated doubts. I was surprised to find familiar names: Abraham, Moses, David, Jesus. They were there, not as distant figures, but as part of the same stream of revelation. It was as though the book were stitching together the loose threads of my own spiritual history, connecting tradition, promise, and continuity. The reading advanced slowly, not out of difficulty, but because every line seemed to demand pause. I felt watched by the words, as if it were not I examining the text, but the text examining me. I spent the entire night like that, immersed in chapters that spoke of justice, mercy, accountability, and, above all, the unity of God. By morning, as sunlight slipped through the curtains, I closed the book. Something new had taken root inside me. It was not yet a decision, but it was the certainty that I had found a source I could no longer ignore. The Quran did not offer me only abstract reflections. It spoke plainly, deeply, answering questions that had echoed in me since I saw my daughter surrounded by tubes and machines. In the days that followed, I returned to those pages at random moments, and each time I found passages that seemed to speak directly to my immediate reality. It was as though the book had a life of its own, choosing answers before I even formed the questions. With every reading, I remembered Dr. Hassan's silent gesture. He had not debated me, had not tried to prove anything. He had simply handed me the book and trusted that the rest was beyond him. That realization marked me deeply. I, so used to controlling every detail in the operating room, was discovering that some truths require no imposition. They reveal themselves in their own time, and the unexpected gift resting in my hands was becoming the turning point of my journey. One night, after reading, I closed my eyes and whispered, "Perhaps this is what I asked for. Perhaps this is the path that pleases you." I didn't know how to move forward, but I could no longer deny what had happened. The prayer I made in the hospital had found its answer in the pages now resting on my bedside table. Each day, I went deeper into reading the Quran. The more conviction I gained inside, and the more resistance I encountered outside. What was a silent discovery for me began to sound like a threat to those around me. My wife, noticing the change in my habits, reacted with fear and resentment. She said I was destroying our family, that it was nothing more than a dangerous phase. Our once calm conversations turned into tense arguments, and every meal became an emotional battlefield. When I told my parents, the reaction was even harsher. For them, it was unthinkable that a son raised within Jewish tradition, heir to such deep memories and pain, could even look toward another faith. My father went silent with a look that cut deep. My mother wept as if she had lost a loved one. Days later, I received a letter saying that if I went forward, I should not return to the family home. That rupture opened a wound in me that was hard to heal, but at the same time forced me to choose between pleasing people or keeping the promise I had made to God. At the hospital, where I had once been respected as a professional reference, the atmosphere shifted quickly. Colleagues who once greeted me with admiration began whispering in the hallways. Some saw me as a traitor to my own roots. Others hinted that I had lost my mind. Research projects and conference invitations were cancelled without clear explanations. Little by little, I realized my presence was unwelcome and that my reputation was being corroded, not by medical mistakes, but by the faith I was beginning to profess. I lost privileges, positions of prestige, and friendships I thought were solid. The doors that once opened easily now closed before me. Yet the more the outside world pulled away, the more a new serenity was born inside me. There was a striking contrast between the noise of accusations and the silence filled with peace I found in prayer. This peace did not depend on public acceptance, financial stability, or academic recognition. It was something intimate, profound, sustaining me through the loneliest nights. When I knelt and recited words that had traveled through centuries to reach my hands, I felt as though I had finally found my place, even if everything around me was collapsing. The price of truth was high. I lost comfort, ties, and security, but I understood that living a lie to keep appearances would cost even more. Between the approval of the world and faithfulness to the Creator, I chose what no human court could ever take away. Today, my routine is no longer marked by endless shifts or the pressure of scientific reports, but by the serene rhythm of prayers that mark the day. At dawn, when I place my forehead on the ground, I feel that each heartbeat finds meaning. Science still has its place in me. I continue to respect human knowledge, but now I know that knowledge is not enough if it is not connected to the Creator. The Quran reminds me daily that true wisdom lies in recognizing limits and depending on the one who has none. Studying the revealed words has become as essential as breathing. Each verse opens new windows within me, revealing horizons once hidden by the arrogance of intellect. I learned to read not only with my eyes but with my soul, seeking guidance instead of just information. I no longer study to prove points, but to allow myself to be transformed. This posture, which once seemed like weakness, now represents the greatest strength I have ever known. Faith did not remain theory. I carry with me the responsibility to turn old failures into repair. I try to serve others as a reflection of what I received, visiting the sick without seeking recognition, giving time to those who need a listener, supporting initiatives that ease the pain of strangers. Every gesture, no matter how small, is a way of saying thank you to God for the mercy that reached my daughter, and through her, me. I discovered that gratitude is not a fleeting emotion, but a daily choice that manifests in action. Looking back, I see how many crossroads brought me here. From arrogance in hospital corridors to silent tears in an empty room, from family rejection to the embrace of brothers in faith I later found, everything served to shape my heart. Each loss created space for a greater gain. The certainty that I am walking the path of truth. This conviction allows me to live with simplicity, without fear of what may come. Sharing my journey is not an act of vanity, but of commitment. I know there are people facing similar crises, doctors, parents, professionals of all kinds, who believe they are alone in their struggle. I want every word of mine to testify that God hears even the clumsiest cry. And if this story has reached you, perhaps it is because He wants to ignite something within your heart. If this story has found a place in your life, consider supporting this work through super thanks. That contribution keeps alive the effort of carrying messages like this to many others who would never otherwise hear my voice. It is a simple gesture, but one that multiplies reach and hope, allowing stories of faith and transformation to go where I alone never could. Looking back, I realized that every step, every tear, and every loss had a purpose. It was not just the story of a doctor or a desperate father, but of someone who had to be stripped of all pride to understand that life has meaning only when we surrender to the Creator. I carry with me the certainty that nothing happens by chance, not pain, not hope, not the encounters that change destinies. If this narrative has stirred faith, courage, or even a different reflection in you, don't keep it only to yourself. Share this video in groups and on social media. Perhaps a single word may reach someone who is living the same emptiness I once knew, and it may be the breath they need to carry on. I have learned that simple gestures can transform entire lives. A prayer whispered through tears, an unexpected act of kindness, a message shared at the right moment. None of these are small when they touch a wounded heart. That is why what you do by sharing this story matters more than you think. And if you want to keep walking with me on this journey of faith and discovery, watch the next video. In it, you will find another voice, another experience, another testimony that may resonate within you in ways you don't expect. Because each story is a bridge, and each bridge brings us closer to better understanding the meaning of life before God.